Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Brenda Lawson. I'm the interim president of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to 1154 Boylston Street and to those joining us online for this evening's program. At the MHS, we're committed to bringing people together with thought-provoking programs that delve into the complexities of history and encourage people to share their observations, interpretations, and ideas. We are able to do so because of the support provided by friends like you. You can learn more about our programs and how to support us at www.masshist.org. It's wonderful to partner once again with the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America in Massachusetts on presenting the William Hickling Prescott Award for Excellence in Historical Writing. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Lydia Fittler-Kimball, President of the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America in Massachusetts, to present the award and to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Brenda. Good evening. I'm Lydia Kimball, President of the NSCDA-MA, otherwise known as the National Society of the Colonial Dames in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. First of all, I'd like to thank Mass Historical for being such a stellar partner. Carol Knopf, Olivia Saya, Amelia Mix, Brenda Lawson, and everyone else who I've missed have been wonderful for us to work with. Tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome those of you here in person, as well as those of you joining us on Zoom. We're so lucky to have Stacy Schiff here with us tonight to accept the William Hickling Prescott Award for Excellence in Historical Writing. Established in 2013 by the Colonial Dames at the urging of the late Dame Susan Shelby Harding, the Prescott Award is presented biannually. In 2022, the Dames partnered with Mass Historical to present the award to Joanne Freeman and Heather Cox Richardson, a partnership which has continued. This year, Susan Harding's husband, Doug, has very generously endowed the award in Susan's memory, enabling the Dames and hopefully Mass Historical to continue the award, recognizing in perpetuity literary accomplishments and contributions in the field of historical writing. According to our run of show outline, I'm meant to produce Stacy with the award, then introduce her and Megan Marshall. However, at the risk of going off script, I realized that I really should introduce Stacy before I present her with the award and then introduce Megan. Stacy's accomplishments are many and impressive. A Pulitzer Prize winner for Véra, Mrs. Vladimir Nabokov, and a Pulitzer Prize finalist for Saint-Exupéry, Stacy has been awarded numerous other prizes, including the George Washington Book Prize and the Ambassador Award in American Studies, among others. Many of you will be familiar with her book, Cleopatra, A Life, published in 2010 to great acclaim. However, amazing as these accomplishments are, the books that particularly brought Stacy's accomplishments in the field of historical writing to the attention of the Dames and Mass Historical are The Great Improvisation, Franklin, France, and the Birth of America, The Witches, Salem, 1692, and her most recent book, The Revolutionary Sam Adams. As has been written about the Revolutionary, Stacy Schiff brings her masterful storytelling skills to illuminating Adams' transformation from the aimless son of a well-off family to a tireless, beguiling radical who mobilized the colonies. I could go on, but Stacy should have a chance to speak for herself. It's my great pleasure to present her with the 2024 William Hickling Prescott Award for Excellence in Historical Writing. I'd now like to introduce Megan Marshall, with whom Stacy will be in conversation this evening. Megan, too, is a Pulitzer Prize winner for Margaret Fuller, A New American Life, and a Pulitzer Prize finalist for the Peabody Sisters, three women who ignited American Romanticism. Other awards include the Francis Parkman Prize, the Mark Linton History Prize, and Megan is a two-time winner of the Massachusetts Book Award in Nonfiction. Her new essay collection, After Lives, on biography and mysteries of the human heart, will be published in February of 2025. Megan is the Charles Wesley Emerson College professor at Emerson College, where she teaches in the MFA Creative Writing program. Ladies, over to you, and thank you.
Thank you, Lydia, and thank you, MHS, for having us here and hosting this event. I'm honored to have been invited to pitch questions to Stacy Schiff this evening. Can you hear all right? Okay? I want to begin by adding a bit of praise to what we've already heard. Stacy's one of the most modest people I know, far more interested in the lives of the people she writes about than in her own. And she's nearly as good at deflecting compliments as she is at selecting the precise superlatives to describe her subjects. But I want to say that Stacy Schiff has been a leading light for me and for all biographers working in the last decade of the 20th century and the first quarter of the 21st. She carries on the great tradition established by Barbara Tuchman, Antonia Fraser, and David McCullough of writing thoroughly researched historical narratives that draw in a broad, history-hungry readership. And she has pushed us forward with her eclectic choices of subject, her decision to view them from unconventional perspectives, and with her inimitable prose style. I think any paragraph from her 6 books would hold up well on one of those ID quizzes we used to take in English class. We can tell by the rhythm of the sentences, the choice of verbs, the vivid atmospheric description. This is a Stacy Schiff paragraph.
I'm from New England. That was really hard to sit through.
See what I said?
Oof, we done yet?
Yep. A little praise for William Hickling Prescott, too. Most of you know that Prescott is credited with having set a high standard back in the early 19th century for use of archival sources in historical writing. Here we are in one of the great archives of the United States, if not the world. I'm going to ask Stacy a first question. Can you give us an example of a document you found in an archive that sparked your work on one of your books, or that you were simply astonished to discover?
Yes, and I should start by saying this is one of the rare times where I've sat in this room and felt like I knew what I was talking about. Because normally I sit in this room, I don't know how you feel, and think, I'm never going to figure it out. I'm never going to find the document I'm really looking for. I don't really know what I'm looking for, and I'm never going to finish. So I'm loving this assumption that I have some competence in this sport.
Not everyone may know that this is the reading room.
This is the reading room.
It was all taken apart and chairs put in, so thank you to the
I think
staff.
that would be this would be the moment where I would normally talk about Harbottle Door, the obsessive hardware store owner who, and I'll just mention him briefly when I pass on to something else, the obsessive Boston hardware store owner who just had this prescient sense in the 1760s that history was in the air and started to keep a collection of Boston newspapers, and who seems to have been a somewhat underemployed and obsessive hardware store owner, which meant that he spent his time annotating those newspapers. And it is thanks to his marginalia and his crazy quilt of an index that, first of all, we have something we almost never have in history, which is the man in the street reacting to the events which we know as the headlines. And we have, from my research, a real code to who was writing what, because it's Harbottle Dorr who in large part was able to identify many of the pseudonyms under which Samuel Adams wrote his propaganda pieces. But I will pass along from Harbottle Dorr to two things which I really, I think really helped with this book, and which I don't think I've ever spoken about. One is the Committee of Donations notebook, I think it is, which is in the collection. After the intolerable acts, when the Boston port has been shut down, many of the towns in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and many other colonies begin to send gifts to the poor blockaded Bostonians. And Samuel Adams makes it his business to write thank you notes. But the thank you notes don't really come as thank you notes, they come as kind of anthems to the cause. And this was an incredible attempt at bringing the colonies together. With many of these notes, he says, essentially, the crown has succeeded in uniting us in a way we could never have united ourselves. Everything is coming to Boston, casks of oil, leather breeches, some colony actually sends liquor, flour, all of these things, shoes. And for each of these, Adams meticulously writes these extraordinary notes, often mentioning God, very often mentioning the overreach on Parliament's part, and very often just enforcing the common cause. So it's kind of a thrilling set of documents to see. And the other, I guess, would be just after Lexington and Concord, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, the two most wanted men in Massachusetts, ride to the Continental Congress together. And they stop in New York, where they are greeted as conquering heroes. And while sitting in their rooms under guard, each of them writes, one to his fiancée, in Hancock's case, once to on Adams's part, to his wife. And these two letters, I think the originals of both of which are here, I read them here in any case, could not be more different. Hancock's is about the extraordinary pageantry with which the two are received in New York. No one has ever had a warmer welcome. There are people hanging from the rooftops and the chimneys and the rafters. And Adams's is, I hope you're okay, where are you moving to? Not a word about the drama, not a word about the adulation, and barely a word about Lexington and Concord. And I should say Hancock barely mentions that he's not alone. He thinks this reception was entirely meant for him. So it's just a wonderful, they're literally in adjoining rooms with guards outside their doors in an unnamed New York inn, and they're writing these letters, which are just such perfect encapsulations of who they were as the sort of odd couple of the American Revolution.
Thank you. And thank you on behalf of the MHS for those kind words. So let's go back to the beginning of your work as a biographer. You're one of a handful of writers I can think of who started out as book editors. The biographers with a background in publishing that come to mind are Justin Kaplan, the Pulitzer Prize winning biographer of Mark Twain and Walt Whitman, and Amanda Vail, whose biographies of Sarah and Gerald Murphy, Jerome Robbins, and others really hit the mark. Of course, the best-known writer who started out as an editor was the Nobel Prize-winning novelist Toni Morrison. So, Stacy, not to necessarily elevate you to that high, Nobels, they don't come for biographers. But anyway, how did editing books take you to book writing? And did it help? And why did you choose biography, especially since I think you did edit novelists as well?
I did quite a bit of biography as well. I did fiction and nonfiction. The short answer to your question of how did it help is not at all. Only in the sense, in that sense that I just think I don't know if you agree with me, it's very hard to edit yourself. So that spectacular ability that one might have, or however spectacular the ability one might have to read someone else's prose with some perspective and lucidity, just never seems to come back for me. It does 10 years later because I just read this and I want to rewrite it. There's a bit I think of help in the sense of pitching a book. in writing a proposal. I'm a really good proposal writer, which is to say I write really short proposals because I know that editors have no attention spans. And I think most of our colleagues write long proposals thinking that that will give an editor more enticing material, but I know that no editor can sit still that long. So that's one advantage. I left to write my first book, which was a biography of the French aviator and author Saint-Exupéry, because I thought the book needed to exist. There was no, he spends his life split in part between France and America. He had been written about from the French side. He had never really been written about from the American side. And it was it was a particularly lucky moment because he who had been born in 1900 but died in 1944 had at the end of his life flown with a lot of young American servicemen, all of whom were still alive. So it was this sort of sweet spot of some of the early pioneers of French aviation were actually in their 90s and still alive, and then I had this kind of Greek chorus of American colonels who had known Saint-Exupéry at the end of his life when he was very famous. And the editors and the agents and the girlfriends were also all around. So it was kind of a sweet spot in terms of the source material. And I assumed I would leave publishing and write that book and then return to publishing. And then oddly, what happens after you write a book is that people think you're a biographer. And they say, well, what are you doing next? And the idea for the second book kind of fell about kind of naturally after that. And I have never managed to return to publishing.
That's to our benefit, certainly, as your reader. So, still on the subject of beginnings, I've asked Stacy to read the opening paragraphs of her first biography, Saint-Exupéry, from 1994, and her most recent one, The Revolutionary Samuel Adams, from 2022, and then tell us a bit about whatever comes to mind as you revisit the beginnings. I'm afraid you're going to say you want to rewrite this, but I love this.
If anyone has suggestions, I'd be happy to entertain them because I think they're...
Let me paperclip that. So we'll start with Saint-Exupéry.
In 1928, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry was as settled as he would ever be. He had no financial worries, no romantic entanglements, no concerns regarding his employment. His home was the Western Sahara, his house a wooden shack that had sailed from France to the desert 5 years before. On one side it gave on the ocean, which at high tide lapped up against his window, on the other the desert. Dwarfed by an impressive-looking Spanish fort with a crenellated wall, the shack was meant to stand guard over a steel and fabric airplane hangar. Otherwise, the perfectly flat horizon was obstructed only, occasionally, by the tents of nomads. Saint-Exupéry was 28 years old, and since October of the previous year had been chief of the airfield at Cape Juby. I have never, he would write 15 years later, loved my house more than when I lived in the desert.
I love it.
Well, I'm glad for
I
that.
love the place. I love the tone. I love the, where you've drawn us into this story. Did you know you would start there?
It was a first book, so I didn't know anything. I knew that I needed, this is a man who who has an incredibly peripatetic life, the result of which many of us know from The Little Prince. So that The Little Prince's cosmic peregrinations are in many ways parallel to what his author experiences. So I knew I wanted to give a sense of that exoticism to this kind of flamboyant French aristocrat who was at home really everywhere in the world and nowhere in the world. And I knew that his saying he felt at home in this one place was exceptional because he really doesn't, the drama of the life in short is that he is among pilots highly suspect because of his literary credentials, and among the makers of literature in Paris, he is deeply demeaned because of the fact that he's a greasy-handed pilot. So he really doesn't have he's a man of great camaraderie, but he doesn't really have a cohort. And so I knew I needed to start with him established somewhere where he somehow felt at home, and that he should feel at home in this godforsaken corner of the Western Sahara just struck me as the perfect place to start.
Well, I agree. And no editing of yourself.
I think the publisher would probably agree with you on that one.
Yeah. So between Saint-Exupéry, we have Véra, Nabokov, Benjamin Franklin, Cleopatra, the accused witches of Salem. I'm not going to call them witches.
Thank you.
And then Samuel Adams. And I've asked Stacy to read the first two paragraphs, actually, so we can get Adams on stage. And I guess that will give you a hint as to, in some ways, how this is different. But Go for it.
A glimmer, a gleam, the hurry of hoofs. A sturdy, square-jawed man speeds through the night with an urgent message on a borrowed horse. His topcoat flaps behind him. A bright moon hangs overhead. Within days, he'll know he's participated in some kind of history, though he'll hesitate to attach his name to it for decades, and is never to know that his own account will be obliterated, the adrenaline alone enduring, by verse, leaving him trapped in tetrameter, a mythic figure eternally jouncing his way toward Lexington. It's just after midnight. Despite a near encounter with a pair of British officers, Paul Revere has made excellent time. Only 2 hours earlier, he had rushed through town to the home of the last remaining Patriot leader in occupied Boston. On previous occasions, Revere had stood at hand while Dr. Joseph Warren wrote out secret messages for him to carry. Already in advance of this evening, Revere has devised a system. Friends await him on the north side of town, where they've hidden a boat in which to row him to Charleston. From there, he'll ride 12 miles west. He knows he has minutes before British regulars lock down Boston. He knows, too, that Warren has dispatched an earlier rider by a longer route with a similar message. Both speed towards Samuel Adams and John Hancock in Lexington. What the newspapers would later term Revere's secret and speedy intelligence was simple. British regiments are on the move. Adams and Hancock are their quarry. Revere gallops off to warn of imminent arrest, if not outright assassination.
All right. Wonderful to hear you read that, and it brings out some of the great words I was just noting trapped in tetrameter. What a great phrase. Did you enjoy writing that?
I might have smiled, yeah.
So how did you know this was where to start?
I don't know if you've ever had this problem. Are there incidents you've written about where they have been written so many times? Yeah, exactly. So it's like, let me go back to Cleopatra for a second. You have to kill Julius Caesar off in Cleopatra. Do you know how many times the Ides of March have been done? I mean, it's an impossibly, you have to, it was like the fall of France in the Saint-Exupéry book, which my husband accused me of taking longer to make fall than actually France took to fall. I mean, every book you own has this scene in it already, and somehow you're going to have to write it and make it seem fresh to the reader. I think in this case, it was partly that I knew I had to work. Well, no, I think I woke up in the middle of the night and realized I didn't know where Revere, we all have the poem in our heads, we all can recite our Longfellow, but none of us really thinks for a second about where he's going. And I realized that was the point of the book, that if you put Samuel Adams back in the picture, you get a completely different revolution. And that this was Revere writing us into the book in a way that I thought Anne Foster at the beginning of The Witches flies us in, or hoped flies one into the book, but that this was meant to upend your assumptions, that we suddenly were going to think about, well, where was he going that night? We know about the ride, we know about the lanterns, we know about the horse, which of course we don't really know about because that's fictional, but what was the destination? And so I just thought that was a way to just kind of subvert the expectations of the reader, while also making very clear on the first few pages that we are talking about someone whose name we barely recognize, but who somehow in the 18th century was one of the most wanted men by the crown.
And I think that this...
Also, always start with the word assassination if you can, right?
Don't end with it. And I think this is in the present tense. Is that
It is,
right?
it is.
So was that, you did that before?
I think I did that with
But-
Cleopatra as well. I think it's a little cheap, honestly, but no one seemed to notice except you. Have you been meaning to tell me that you felt it was cheap?
I've done it myself. But,
Yes, I know you have. I wasn't going to mention that.
But then it quickly migrates into the
Yeah,
past,
yeah.
the historical past, which I love that as well too. So you put Cleopatra and Samuel Adams on the same page for a minute there. I think maybe they also have in common the difficulty about sources, about their interior lives, or in Cleopatra's her life at all. Can you? I'm sure you've said much about this, but we want to hear it again, and we want to hear more.
Oddly enough, I mean, it sounds like the oddest couple truly in history. I think the Cleopatra and Samuel Adams were the two books that were closest in nature for me, in terms of trying to pull someone from the shadows. I had had that problem with my second book with Vladimir Nabokov, who was pathologically private, to the point where she had sometimes edited her husband's galleys and then erased her comments from the margin so that no one would ever find them. So this was a woman who was constantly erasing the trail after herself, and who, if asked outright a question of fact, would generally deny it even when it was true. So, that was like trying to pull the cat out of the carrier at the vet. That was just this feeling of this person who's resisting you at all times. This was just more a kind of hide and seek. Adams, famously, we know from John Adams's writing, burns much of his correspondence because he's very eager not to compromise their Confederates and not to compromise anyone who is at that moment committing sedition, if not treason. And so a large portion of the correspondence is gone. Adams is very much a team player and an extremely diffident man, and he very much takes to the wings. And so figuring out a way to somehow coax him from the wings felt in a way like working with the real paucity of materials that we have if we try to attempt a life of Cleopatra. And in both cases, the thing that was, I think, probably most rich and that the two subjects had most in common, the best way to reconstruct the life, and I say this with a little bit of hesitation because you don't want to rely too much on this, is from the writings of their enemies. So if you really want to know what Samuel Adams is up to, he doesn't claim credit for it, but you can be certain that the royal governors and the customs officials who were then in Boston were writing back to London about it regularly. Sometimes they credit Adams with things he didn't really do. Sometimes they credit him with articles he actually didn't himself write. Most of the time, however, they're reporting on conversations or they're reporting on activities which do seem to tally with the other sources. And in Cleopatra's case, there's absolutely nothing unless you're willing to reconstruct a life from the accounts of her enemies. So that also felt very similar. And I think in both cases you're reading with a grain of salt, and part of the task is to remind the reader about the materials with which you're working, because they can be tendentious and they can be extremely biased.
So another challenge as to what's really going on in the minds of these people is really, I have to say, my favorite of your books is The Witches. And in part, I was thinking about this now, I think it's every chapter starts with a kind of phantasmical occurrence that one might think was written in the present tense, but I think actually is not. You're working with accounts of what people said went on, these accusations, but do we really know what was going on in the minds of these young women, the girls? And you're also writing from sort of many perspectives, a very different narrative challenge than a book that coheres around the life story of one person. They're born, they die, they do what they do in between.
That's the answer to your question about why the first book was biography, because biography seems like the perfect thing on which to test your chops. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and at the end you get to kill the subject. So it's very gratifying, but it also, no matter how much you play with it, it always does end in the same place, right? But anyway, go ahead.
So how did you handle how did you decide that you could manage this tale that, I guess, it has a beginning, middle, and end itself, this era, but the many perspectives and and that it's been written about so much.
It has. It's generally, there are a number of narrative histories, but for the most part, people have written about Salem with a thesis in mind, trying to prove that this is the universal key that's going to unlock what happened in 1692 for us. And my idea, perverse though it may sound, was to write a narrative history of what happened and reveal the reasons perhaps for why it happened, and there is no single cause, obviously, only at the very end. And I somehow thought that was going to be gratifying for the reader, and I'm not sure that's true, but that seemed to me the honest way to write it. And I think part of the problem with that book is you are indeed writing about a delusion, and you need for the reader to somehow buy into the delusion. And speaking of like moments in archives where you think, I don't know what this is, but I know I'm going to use it. I think the first week I was working at the Peabody Essex, which is where the originals for the 1,000 pages of transcript we still have were. I came across the account of Anne Foster, who's a middle-aged Andover farm woman, a very pious woman, who swears in front of the local magistrates to tell the truth and nothing but the truth, and then goes on to recount how she had flown from her Andover farm to a satanic Sabbath on a stick over the trees with bread and cheese in her pocket. And she shared the stick with her neighbor, Martha Carrier. And not only that, but they had actually had a crash landing. And she knew that she had had this crash landing because her legs still hurt. And she's swearing this in front of the local men of tremendous weight, as if she honestly believes it, which she clearly did. And I just thought if you could somehow start there, if you could somehow buy the fact that this person believed what she was retailing, then that was the way into this. That was a way to get the reader used to the idea that the ground wasn't going to be quite so firm under one's feet for the next 5,000 pages. I've forgotten how long that book is, but it's long. And the answer to your question is you have a huge cast of characters. I had to leave people out, which felt unfair, but I ended up using those victims who advance the narrative. So either those victims who reveal something about the misgivings of the court, or something about the misjudgments of the court, or it becomes a sort of satanic game of telephone, and the person who hands the story off to somebody else made it into the book, and the person who repeated the story probably didn't. So there's some trimming of the victims, which doesn't seem quite fair. And then, of course, you have the authorities, and you have the Boston ministers, who are really the ones who are kind of seeing that the narrative congeals in some sensible way, and to whom the court is constantly turning for advice and counsel, and who are generally, especially in Cotton Mather's case, returning answers that are sort of either ors. You know, you must embrace a speedy and vigorous prosecution, but you must be delicate and exacting in your standards. There's always a nevertheless in the middle of these statements. So you do have an enormous cast, and that is why that book begins with a Russian novel-style key to characters.
Well, I just maybe should pause and say, if you haven't read any of these books, I mean all of these books, if you have not read all of these books, I recommend you. Don't have to read them in chronological order as they were written, but so this is kind of a bundled question and made up of a question of mine and one of Olivia's, our MC here. Not our MC, whatever, our production manager, put it that way, Olivia, a wonderful staffer at MHS. I think everyone would like to know how you choose your subjects, and does the time you're writing in have any effect on that? Would you be able to write Saint-Exupéry or Cleopatra now, or would you write them differently if you did?
This is a question I often ask myself. How did I get into this pickle? And then I'm sitting at a table at the MHS doing it all again. Yeah, I don't have a really easy answer to that one. I looked for different reasons at the endnotes to Véra the other day and remembered for the first time in many years how many members of the Russian emigration I had had to visit to write that book, and thought I could never write this book today. I mean, just the travel alone that book entailed. And also I signed the contract to write that book because the Nabokov collection had been sold to the New York Public Library. I had small children. I thought, great, I can work out of New York. And then it turned out that although the collection had been sold, it had not been delivered and was in no danger of being delivered. And so without my small children, I went off to Switzerland for the better part of 2 years. So, you know, there were things along the way that I would definitely not do again. I think, and I've said this before, I think with you, that a question begins to kind of assemble itself in the back of your mind, and whether you realize it consciously or not, you develop some sort of obsession with finding an answer to that question. And you often don't realize that that question is what led you to the subject until, in my case, many years later. For example, I did not notice when I was working on the Salem book, a story that begins with two adolescent girls who begin to suffer from some kind of spasmodic, some paroxysms which are clearly being caused by something psychological, that I was living with two teenage girls. I never noticed that until after the book was published. And I was a newlywed when I wrote Véra, which is a book about a marriage. So, you know, were there things that probably played subconsciously in the background? Yes. You have accused me of wanting to come back to Massachusetts with every book I seem to be writing. So there's one unified theory, which could be very true. I do think that there was something with the Revolutionary where I felt very strongly as if patriotism was a word that had developed a sort of nasty reputation, and I wanted somehow to redeem it. and that was playing in the background. And I had also been working with Ben Franklin materials a lot, and that book somewhat fell out of the Franklin stuff in the sense that I was looking for someone who was really a game changer, someone who actually changes the climate. And Adams fit that bill more precisely than I could have hoped, and I knew that only because of what his contemporaries said about him, not because of anything that had been written about him since. And I found that to be fascinating, that he could have been so forgotten and so left by the side of the road after everything that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and everyone else had said about him for those years. But I'm not good on the unified theory. I know. I wish I could be more consistent. I have this conversation with Joe Ellis very often, that he is smart enough to stay in the same century and with the same cast of characters.
But maybe, obviously, you're attracted to jumping around, and in time and place, you happen to speak French quite well, so that helps you. You can do the kind of work that some of them can.
I also worked a great deal in French archives, which is something I will never do again. But at one point was researching the Ben Franklin book. The Franklin book is about his 8.5 years in France as essentially making sure that France bankrolls the American Revolution. And I was working in the National Archives, which I would not wish on anyone. And I said to a French colleague who was helping me, who was working on his own book, but we had become friends, this archive is designed to flummox the Anglo-Saxon mind. And he said, oh no, Stacy, this archive is designed to flummox any mind. So I felt slightly better. But the retrieval of information in a French archive is not exactly commensurate with the Massachusetts Historical Society, to say the least.
So now we've talked a lot about archives, but what about the interviewing of subjects and drawing them out and not offending them when you write about them?
Yeah. So for the Nabokov book, I very early on interviewed a very well-known, in Nabokov's day, she had been a Wellesley academic who was then living in New York, with whom he was very friendly shortly after Nabokov came to America. And we had a lovely interview, and about 6 months later, another scholar whom I interviewed for the book said to me, you know they had a torrid affair, don't you? So, which I had completely missed in the course of my interview. So I was forced to go back to this then quite elderly woman and essentially say, is it true that you slept with Nabokov? And I think I put that off almost until pub date. It was just so hard for me to do, and you will notice that the next book I wrote was about the 18th century. So that should tell you everything you need to know about my comfort asking people really difficult questions.
I'm with you.
Nice thing about Cleopatra, no surviving relatives.
Right. So, but Saint-Exupéry did not, you talked about a lot of interviews for that.
Tons of interviews.
But people were happy to talk, I guess, or did you
People
run into
were
trouble
very
there?
Well, it's an interesting question you ask. People were very happy to talk. In his late 30s, Saint-Exupéry, who was then married, did have a torrid affair with another woman who became pretty much the mainstay of his professional life, as well as really his wife, to put it mildly. She was also married. It was a very French arrangement, you might say. And she had published, I should go back a step. When I started the book, there were 5 or 6 existing French biographies of him. And I was told early on by someone that one of them was written by this mistress under a male pseudonym. So I literally sat in the New York Public Library on my Simon & Schuster lunch hour with all the books on the table in front of me to try to figure out which one was hers. And after about 4 days, it finally occurred to me it was the one that didn't mention his marriage anywhere in the book. So I managed to track her down, and she was very willing to talk to me, but the deal was we could talk, I could not record, and I could not use her real name in the book. So Nelly de Vogüé, as she was in fact named, is Madame de B in the book. I don't know why I picked B. So I was able to get this information out of her. I was never able to see her archives, which are under seal at the Bayenne in Paris, as she very happily informed me on one of our last interviews. They're under seal until, I can't remember the year, 2064, by which time you will be dead. So it was a lovely relationship. I would go to see her every week, and every week she would intimidate me.
Well, now, this is why I'm such a bad interviewer. I when I'm doing my research, I think we missed what happened when you, back to the Nabokov interview and the woman who had the affair. You went back and
I went back to see her.
And what did she say?
And she said, you make an excellent point. And she said, no. And I said, okay, great. And I think I just staggered out of her office as quickly as I could. And in all fairness, it's very likely they didn't have an affair, but this was the word on the street. I know, it's very disappointing when that happens.
All right. Well, I guess that's why you didn't go there. I want to ask you to read now 2 endings, getting to the end, although we'll have time for questions. And I wanted you to read from these books about very differently powerful women, Véra and Cleopatra. So, starting with Véra from 1999, for which you won the Pulitzer Prize, right after you almost won the Pulitzer Prize for St. Exupéry.
Well, you had the same
The same
history.
thing happened. You think
Yeah.
it's never could happen if it didn't happen the
I wonder
first
if
time.
your agent did to you what mine did to me when I called her with enormous excitement to say, you won't believe this, but the book was a finalist for the Pulitzer. And she said, Stacy, that means you lost.
That's not what that means. But, and nobody said that to me. But anyway, I was just going to say, endings, you kind of need to sum up the character and the life, but they also need to continue in the style of the narrative that you've established. And I think Stacy is really very good at this. So these are just the final paragraphs, and since you didn't prepare for this, tell them about that black cat.
With a black cat made it, 2 things I should say about this. This presupposes that you know, as you would from the first page, that pretty much with only one exception, every book Nabokov writes he dedicates to Véra, which, as Nicholson Baker has pointed out, is like a nervous tic. Why would you just dedicate every book to the same person? It would seem to indicate a lack of imagination. But her name is there floating at the front of every single book, except for the one which in Russian is dedicated to his mother. And their black cat will put in an appearance here, who had mysteriously appeared several years earlier when Nabokov himself had died. It had never prowled around before, and suddenly it appeared out of nowhere, and great weight obviously was put in this strange appearance. And I will also say that Dmitry Nabokov, Nabokov's only child and surviving son, was pretty much my key to the kingdom when I wrote this book. The archives were in his moldy basement, and there I worked for many, many months. But the only problem he had when I published the book was it wasn't a black cat, it was evidently a gray cat. So this what I'm about to read, may contain an error, although when I interviewed the person who told me this, they said black. Not for a second had she believed you could go home again, but she understood that patience prevails, that as her husband had remarked, the movements of stars may seem crazy to the simpleton, but the wise men know that the comets come back. So did the black cat, a fat, fluffy animal who put in a single appearance the afternoon of the funeral, as if to pay his respects, and then disappeared for good. 6 months after Véra's death, Leningrad became St. Petersburg again. After 1987, you could even buy a copy of Lolita there. In 1959, Véra had predicted that the critics had not even begun to write about that book. Finally, around the world, they had. A vast number of things went with her, we know now, but a fraction of what he and she knew, which was exactly as she had wanted it. Her name survived her, on those pages that so perfectly recapitulate the theme of the life, near but keeping a respectful distance from the works that follow, proffered by her husband in a line as straightforward as any Nabokov ever wrote. Surrounded by a deep and comfortable sea of blank space, she's right there, one end of a luminous brain bridge, plain as day, front and center, hidden in full view. Think I should rewrite that one too?
No. We didn't really ask how you decided to write about Véra.
I spent a lot of my collegiate years electing to read Nabokov rather than go to class. And I think this grew out of a very healthy or unhealthy obsession with Nabokov that I couldn't quite shake. When I started, there was, and there remains, a monumental 2-volume biography by Brian Boyd. And there was another quite good, there were 2 other books by another biographer named Andrew Field. in all of those 2 volumes and the other 2 books, Véra is mentioned in passing, always as the person who was instrumental in every possible way, but whom the biographers couldn't write about. And it was almost like a red flag to me. Who was this woman who was so important that no biographer dared approach her? And again, my timing was somewhat lucky in that she had died a couple of years before I first wrote Dmitri Nabokov a letter and said, is it possible that you would let me write a book about your mother? Because she was clearly so essential to the cause. But it was a very strange, you could almost hear the chairs scraping as the biographers let her out of the room, because the deal had always been, yes, I will open my husband's archive to you on the condition that you never mention my existence. And it was a particularly codependent, I guess we would say today, it was a particularly intimate relationship. Many people just assumed they came as a pair. She typed every page, and no biographer had ever really gone near what that meant in terms of what was the literary contribution of someone who is committing the words to paper, what went on between them in a closed room when she's reading his work back to him. When Nabokov went on his famous butterflying expeditions in a car, who drove the car, because he didn't drive? She's there at every moment, and you see her refracted through most of the works in different ways. And she actually writes paragraphs that become part of Speak Memory. Those are actually Véra's. So it just seemed as if it was waiting for someone, or I hoped it was waiting for someone to come along and make sense of. And I lived with some doubt about that for the first couple of years. And then finally, when I did go to the archives at the New York Public Library, because some things were there, the archivist, when I sort of mumbled, I'm trying to write a book about Véra Nabokov, said, I've been waiting for you. And that that kept me going for another 2 years.
I'm wondering if there's something, of the biographer in that role of being recessive but enabling.
And I think that there may be some identification of the author with that role, right? The person who doesn't have to appear in the picture.
That. All right, so now Cleopatra, the ending of Cleopatra, I will just, not to put the pressure on, but it made me cry when I read it, preparing for this.
In her adult life, Cleopatra would have met few people she considered her equal. To the Romans, she was a stubborn, supreme exception to every rule. She remains largely incomparable. She had plenty of predecessors, few successors. With her, the age of empresses essentially came to an end. In 2,000 years, only 1 or 2 other women could be said to have wielded unrestricted authority over so vast a realm. Cleopatra remains nearly alone at the all-male table, in possession of a hand both flush and flawed. She got a very good deal right, and one crucial thing wrong. It's impossible to fathom how she could have felt at the end of the summer of 30 BC, as Octavian closed in, as it became more and more clear that there were to be no further reversals of fortune, no more brilliantly savaged futures, that she and Egypt were this time plainly lost. What is it to lose your country? A great suffering? A queen asks her son in Euripides. The greatest, even worse than people say, he replies. The fear and fury must have shattered Cleopatra as she realized she was to become the woman who destroyed the Egyptian monarchy, as a 3rd century AD chronicler has it. For her monumental loss, there were no consolations, including, assuming she believed in one, a brilliant afterlife.
Well, you made me cry again.
Aww.
What is it to lose your country?
The difficulty with Cleopatra is that the game is over when she comes to the throne, but of course we know it and she doesn't. So again, this is the question of how do you build suspense for something where every reader comes to the book knowing that what is about to happen is preordained on some level, and trying to make it seem somehow as if it's all a matter of chance.
So one last question before we go to the audience. You're working on something new, I hope?
I hope I can come back to the MHS. I'm working on a book that I'm extremely bad at describing, although I did try earlier today. And the 2 victims are in the room. They're falling asleep even as I open my mouth. I'm working on a book about the last 5 years of Benjamin Franklin's life. He comes back from France in 1785. He's uncertain if he's making the right decision in coming back. He's in terrible health. No one believes he's going to even survive the trip back. He doesn't know how he'll be greeted in America, whereas he is a reigning, essentially sovereign. He's the greatest celebrity in Europe at this point. And he comes back essentially to die. And of course gets on the boat off the coast of England and is immediately resuscitated and feels better than he's felt in 30 years, and goes on to have a sort of extraordinary last chapter where he's presiding spiritually in many ways over the Constitutional Convention and changes his mind about slavery and is corresponding with the entire world. So it's a sort of elegiac book in some way, and I hope an essayistic book, but honestly I don't know what it is yet.
Well, thanks for confiding in us. I hope you've been planning some questions out there, and I will call out the gentleman in the middle of the, yes, you had your hand up very quickly, so.
I was curious, as an author, how do you decide on the various topics? Your books are on quite disparate subjects.
You know, I think that in a way some books are reactions against the earlier book, and that can be in terms of subject. I mean, I don't like to repeat myself, unfortunately. And I think that can be in terms of subject, that you're running away from something you've done before, and it can be in terms of the archive. So, for example, the book on Ben Franklin in France, the French years are 2.5 times as documented as the entire rest of Franklin's life combined, and most of that material is in the Quai d'Orsay archives. Don't get me started. And by the way, when I was working on the book, it was an election year, so the archivists went out on strike every couple of months. I mean, it was impossible to get your work done. And I think that after I worked on those documents, which are all of them in 18th century French, and you know, we're talking, there were no typewriters yet. We're talking about really elaborate, beautifully written French when it wasn't faded beyond any distinction. I think the idea after that book of writing about a woman who had left no archive was very appealing. So Cleopatra Cleopatra had in fact been on the horizon for a long time, and I just couldn't figure out how to do it, and I realized it was doable after essentially drowning in the Franklin archive for those years. So I think to some extent one book does lead to another, and I think Samuel Adams may have taken me back to Ben Franklin.
All right, how about in this row here?
On the relations of Sam and John Adams.
So it somewhat undermines, I think, our assumptions. John is the younger cousin by 12 or 13, I've now forgotten how many years, and is starstruck when he meets his older cousin Samuel. They did not know each other until the early 1760s. And they find each other largely during the run-up to the Sugar and Stamp Acts, largely out of their mutual hatred for Thomas Hutchinson, of which they both leave long paragraphs about the things they object to in the life of Thomas Hutchinson. I can't remember which one is longer, but these are like laundry lists of how much they hate Thomas Hutchinson, essentially for having collected such a bouquet of titles and having consolidated so much power among his family and his friends. And in an interesting way, that is kind of a microcosm for what both men are going to feel later about regulation from London. It's clearly Samuel Adams who talks John Adams into defending the soldiers after the Boston Massacre. It's clearly Samuel Adams who introduces John around town. Later, when John goes to France, for example, to annoy Benjamin Franklin, he will have to explain to people he's not the famous Mr. Adams. And you can imagine how that made John Adams feel. So, you know, and from that point on, the scale begins to tip the other way. Samuel Adams really falls off the radar post-revolution when he's completely out of touch with the climate of the country and the way that the new federation is moving. He's not a federalist. And John is on the ascendant. So that by the end of their lives, they see the world very differently. They have very different ideas of political architecture generally. And John has become to despair of essentially what a fossil his cousin Samuel has become. That's the capsule summary.
Olivia, are there any questions online that we should try? Yeah.
Well, you were talking about how Samuel Adams was becoming a fossil, but somebody is asking why wouldn't he have been chosen for president or vice president?
So this is something I can't really explain. Samuel Adams seems, in his earlier years, Samuel Adams has a really magnificent gift to join people together and to galvanize a population and to essentially recruit even women and children to the cause. He seems to lose that gift. He seems to lose his ability to read people and to essentially drum up that kind of solidarity as he ages. And I don't know how much of this is, he's quite old at this point, I should add. He's not as old as Franklin, but he's among the oldest of the revolutionaries. How much of that is age? His health clearly suffers post-revolution. How much of that is that he's a provincial man? He really very much believes in New England purity. He's often talking about the ancient purity of principles as opposed to what he's seeing in the southern colonies. He's, as I said, not a committed Federalist, and he really becomes, as someone calls him, that great unspotted lump of patriotism. He really becomes a kind of relic of an earlier day, beloved for what he had done for the cause of independence, but of no obvious use in the Republic as it is formed.
Another question about him, asking how much credit does he deserve for instigating the Tea Party?
Well, on that list of questions you wish you could ask your subject, that is probably my second one for Samuel Adams. But from what we can see of the fingerprints on the planning and what we can see in the writings, for example, of Thomas Hutchinson, who says the next day Adams was never in greater glory, I think he gets a lot of credit. He's running at this point, or he's the head at this point of the Boston Committee of Correspondence. And curiously, for the two meetings of that committee just before the destruction of the tea, the meeting notes are, these are in the New York Public Library manuscripts room, the meeting notes are annotated, no business was transacted. On no other dates did they bother writing no business was transacted. So it does seem as if they're plotting something. And he does write to a friend a few weeks earlier in London saying, if some kind of accommodation isn't made, I will be writing you on a non-trivial subject soon. I mean, he seems pretty much to be conspicuously left behind that night and not seen on the wharf for good reason.
So what's the first question you were going to ask?
I don't remember anymore now that I said that. Ask me later. Yeah.
Any more questions from out here? Yes. Oh.
It takes you a couple of years to write a book, right? And during that time, who do you talk to, and how do you know you're done?
What a lovely question. A couple is a really lovely way of putting it because it takes me 5 or 6 years, and it doesn't feel like a couple to anyone who knows me because I whine incessantly for those 5 or 6 years. Sometimes I whine to Megan, who in addition to being a masterful biographer, is also an extraordinarily generous friend. I would say that there's a small group of writers who hear, and my agent, who are very good at saying, you said this last time. Or I said to my agent this week, I have no idea how to write this book, and he said, you said that with Cleopatra too. So, nobody listens to me is the short answer to your question. I think problems of biography get discussed among biographers, and nobody else ever cares, which is probably as it should be. But there are a small group of us who I think speak quite often, or call each other. No, we can call each other in a biographical emergency, which arises very often. It's like long distance running. It's a very, for me anyway, it's a grueling sport, and especially for those first years, I research entirely and then I write. And those years of just endlessly researching feel like just incessant grocery shopping with nothing to cook. And I don't know really what I'm accumulating, and I don't really know what I'm thinking until I start to go back through the material and hope it's begun at that point to marinate into something. But I feel like and I feel this way now, I feel like I'm in the desert for much of those years.
One of the reasons I asked the questions about moving from editing to writing is I have a former student who's working in publishing now and would like to do more writing, and I just want to say I noticed that you said you were doing some research on Saint-Exupéry on your lunch hour, so you fit that in around other things. You're always fitting.
I think what I was supposed to be doing on those lunch hours was taking agents to lunch, and I think at that point I was realizing I really wanted to write this book. But yes, I would sneak to the New York Public Library and in the reading room, and probably didn't get back to my desk until 2 hours later. So I'm a truant, what can I say? Yeah.
Well done. All right, back here we have a question. Wait a minute to get the mic so people can hear you.
And this will be our last question.
Okay.
Briefly, in terms of verifying facts, one of the, I heard you talk about an anecdote with Paul Robeson Jr., just calling him to make sure or to track down something that might sound too good to be true and to check it out. But that mentality, where does that come from? Because it seems to be missing in many ways.
You're referring to a story, I was told an incredible story, which is far too long to go into at this point, about Nabokov when he was teaching at Cornell, which was such a good story that I was going to contort the narrative completely to include it. It was so delicious. But it had been said about Paul Robeson Jr., the son of the civil rights activist, so I called Paul Robeson Jr. to verify the story, and he said, it's a terrific story, but I never took a course with Nabokov. So that story is on the cutting room floor. I used to have a hard and fast rule that you had to have two sources for anything if you were going to use it, and obviously with Cleopatra that fell apart. And what happened with that book is that the sources were often so discordant. For example, Cleopatra's death, she dies twice because we have two completely irreconcilable descriptions of her death. So one is Plutarch and one is Dio. There was just no other way to do it. So I think the answer to your question is you let the reader know where you're on less firm ground and you don't extrapolate.
Great questions. Thank you, and thank you, Stacy.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you all.
of your
Thank
thoughts.
you.
I just want to say thank you all. First of all, thanks to our wonderful speakers. This was wonderful. Thank you for this terrific program, and thank you to our audience, both in person and virtual, for joining us this evening. We look forward to welcoming you back into the reading room. And please visit our website at www.masshis.org for more information about upcoming programs. Thank you very much, and let's give our speakers one more hand. Thanks.